What is going on, everybody? It is Friday, February the 11th, and that means it's time for my news radar. So let's start off this episode the way that I've started off several of the last episodes, and that is with an update on the progress for Windows 11 being ported to Surface Duo. We're going to look at a tweet here from Gustav himself, the man, the myth, the legend, the person who was actually working on porting Windows 11 over to the original Surface Duo, and he did post this video on the 8th just a few days ago showing Windows 11 actually going through the boot up process. You have your Windows logo there. We boot into a sign-on screen, and it does eventually pass through that sign-on screen and wind up in a Windows desktop. Now, obviously, the biggest thing you're going to notice about this is that the one screen is the only screen that's on. So evidently, we haven't gotten so far as to having the second screen of the dual screen Surface Duo be actually active, and we're kind of restricted to that one screen there on the left. But at any rate, progress is being made. And keep in mind that this is going to be a long process. So he's right now currently just working on polishing up the firmware. I think actually, yeah, here we go. Hasn't done much driver-wise, focusing on polishing the firmware first. So this is going to be sort of a type of situation where he's going to do the groundwork first and then build up from there. So the drivers for things like touch for both screens to be functioning, for Wi-Fi, for the cellular data, these sorts of things, the GPU, on and on and on. This stuff will come later. But at any rate, it's pretty exciting. Windows 11 there is booting on Surface Duo. So now let's talk about some sad news. Just the other day, I brought you guys a news story that talked about the fact that BlackBerry had just sold off many of their patents regarding mobile phones to a new conglomerate that was likely going to look towards maybe suing companies for patent infringement, or maybe they're going to do something better with it, but I kind of doubt it. Anyways, BlackBerry seemed to be sort of distancing themselves from the whole cell phone thing by selling off these patents. Well, interestingly enough, just a few months ago, a company called Onward Mobility, a company who at that time had the current rights to make a BlackBerry branded phone, they had delayed, and they came out and they said, hey, we're not actually dead, the phone is still coming. Well, as of yesterday, we now know that is no longer the case, because the 5G BlackBerry is dead. Onward Mobility has lost the rights to the BlackBerry name. And basically what this article says here is that the continued supply chain issues, the delays that were happening with Onward Mobility, combined with BlackBerry CEO John Chin's change of heart around putting its brand on yet another smartphone, led to the decision to pull support for the projects. And Onward Mobility now has a phone that ostensibly has been kind of somewhat worked on, pretty heavily. This thing does exist. Well, it's not ready to be shipped. Apparently, the design cues are similar to the BlackBerry Priv, which makes this even more of a bummer to me, because I thought the Priv looked awesome. This thing was a vertical slider. All of these, it slid open. There's one where it is slid closed. So that's a bummer for me, because I would have loved to have seen a new modernized version of the Priv. But this thing apparently, look, they had prototypes, they had the thing working, but now they don't have the BlackBerry name to put on it anymore. It wouldn't be called a BlackBerry. So all we can do at this point is just hope that Onward Mobility will take this project, a project that they've definitely dumped a lot of money in since they came together, and that they'll try to continue it and maybe release it under just a different name. They can't call it a BlackBerry, but I mean, if you just can't cancel this thing, all that money you dumped in, all that work, all that time is just gone. You're gonna have to file bankruptcy and close the doors, and that's the end of it. It'll be interesting to see where this thing does go down the line. So now let's talk about a pretty cool little app called Microsoft Your Phone. Obviously, if you're a user, a fan of Surface Duo and Duo 2, I'm sure you know about this application. Perhaps you're a Samsung user, because it's great on Samsung phones as well. It's getting a new set of features, or really just a new feature. Here, this article from Windows Central does talk about it. We're going to get a new little system tray here. So right now, currently, you don't really see your phone down here on the taskbar, but apparently it's going to begin existing on the taskbar in your little overflow, and you'll be able to click on it and see your recently opened apps. And of course, when I say recently opened apps, I mean apps like this. This app is running on my Surface Duo 2, but is streaming wirelessly to my computer where I can scroll through it and interact with it. Well, apparently that app will then exist in this little overflow so you can quickly access it. Now, that's interesting and it might make things easier. You can also just simply pin that app to your taskbar itself to make it even easier to access. But it's just a cool little integration here into Windows 11 or Windows 10, I suppose, with the Your Phone app. Although I still do think that just simply coming over here, right-clicking and pinning to start or taskbar is probably still better than that in some ways. Maybe you don't want it clogging up your bar down there. You want to kind of have it in its own little place. And last but not least, it looks as though we're finally going to be getting a proper sequel to the Surface Pro X. Of course, the Surface Pro X being the ARM-based version of Microsoft's Surface Pro devices. It is thinner, it is lighter, it has better standby, it has better battery life because it does run the ARM version of Windows, which has been coming along quite a bit as of late. But the raw power, the horsepower, is where things definitely need to be picking up and moving along a bit more quickly. In particular, as Apple has released the Apple M1 and the variants now coming out of the M1 processor, which are quite impressive in terms of raw power, leaving the Surface Pro X and these Qualcomm-based chips a little bit in the dust. It seems like we're going to be getting that kick in the pants that we did need. If we read this article here from XDA, we do see some Geekbench scores spotted here on WinFuture for a Surface device with a Snapdragon 8CX Gen 3. And we're getting scores between 867 to about 1,000 on single core and between 4,700 and 5,500 on multi-core. And this isn't that crazy. This is probably pretty early on, and they're probably doing some testing. So you're going to see some variation here until things are kind of settled down. It's not uncommon at all, in particular with phones, as phones are tested, to see their scores rise and rise and rise as they optimize better and better. And as you'll see referenced here on this article, this is important because the Gen 3 version of the 8CX is actually a new chipset, whereas the last one, Gen 2, was just sort of a modification of what already existed. That's why we didn't get a proper Surface Pro X2, because it just wasn't new enough. It wasn't that big of a difference. So the Gen 3 is a pretty large jump forward. And they've got some numbers here to compare these scores. So the 8CX scores are in the ballpark of the Intel Core i5 or of the Ryzen 5 4500U, which is a pretty solid place to be. But the multi-core score here is actually closer to an i7 or the Ryzen 7 5800U, which is, as said here, pretty doggone impressive and represents a pretty massive step up over what we had in the current Surface Pro X. Now, obviously, we've got no word on what this Surface Pro X2 is going to look like, and frankly, I don't think that they really need to change much as we come back here. This is what we're dealing with. Pretty slim bezels. I mean, it was so far ahead of the current Surface Pro 7 design that the Surface Pro 8 kind of just copied the X's design. So I don't really know that you need to do much here. It's already going to be thinner, fanless, and so forth and so on. So simply just boosting the actual performance of the thing is probably going to be more than enough to make the thing a bit more competitive. And it looks as though, based on these Geekbench scores, that is exactly what's going to happen. We probably are going to see the Snapdragon 8CX Gen 3 announced at Mobile World Congress later this month, but don't expect to see the Surface Pro X at that same time. Microsoft gonna march to the beat of their own drum as usual. Probably not going to see anything on that for months down the line. And also keep in mind that Qualcomm is just now truly ramping up to take on Apple with the M1, and we should see more movement from them sooner than later as they do, as I said, try to compete directly with Apple's M1 as computing in general becomes more and more mobile, and ARM clearly, to me, is the way of the not-so-distant future. Guys, thanks for making it through today's episode of News Radar. I'll see you on the next episode, and until next time, stay nerdy, my friends.